Hello, I'm Sofia Nazarenko and you are watching Channel 24. Today my guest is Peter Dickinson, British journalist, editor of UkraineAlert at the Atlantic Council and publisher of Business Ukraine magazine. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Mr. Dickinson, we are speaking at the start of a pivotal week of intense diplomatic efforts to end Russia's war in Ukraine. In the coming days, US President Donald Trump may meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you believe there is any real chance that Putin could agree to a ceasefire during this meeting?
Honestly, no. I don't think we're close to a ceasefire agreement. I think we need to. I'm trying not to be too cynical about the meeting because I think I recognise that there needs to be some sort of a dialogue. But I think that if you want to make progress with someone like Putin, you must talk to him from a position of strength. He only understands the language of strength, and so you must speak to him in the language of strength. And I'm not convinced that Trump is doing that now. I think he's threatened to use strength. He's talked about sanctions measures, tariff measures, and so on. He's encouraged NATO partners to increase their military spending, but I don't think that Putin yet feels it and feels that he needs to make compromises. So I think at this stage, it's really still about Trump learning the realities of what Putin wants and doesn't want. I don't think we're close to a ceasefire agreement. Of course, I hope I'm wrong, but frankly, it doesn't look like it to me.
I'm not sure if you would agree, but the sudden arrangement of meeting between President Trump and President Putin does seem unusual, especially given the chosen location is Alaska, once part of the Russian Empire. How do you explain the choice of this location and the speed at which the meeting was arranged?
Well, the speed, it is very, very hasty. It feels extremely rushed. This sort of thing would normally take, weeks, perhaps even months to prepare. There would be a lot of build-up. There would be preliminary meetings involving the teams of the two principals, so the Russians and the Americans. This, on the contrary, is just really a very rushed affair. It feels like it's been thrown together at short notice because it has been. I think that can be explained because it's Putin's way of distracting Trump from the sanctions, perhaps, or the tariffs that he was talking about, or the measures. So, we've seen Putin do this again and again. The Russians like to do this. Just recently in May, we saw the European leaders coming to Kyiv and saying, if you don't agree to a ceasefire within 48 hours, we're going to impose sanctions. We're going to increase military aid to Ukraine. And Putin responded to that by saying, you know what, let's have a new meeting between Russia and Ukraine. Let's have a new diplomatic meeting between Russia and Ukraine, a big breakthrough. And by doing that, he was able to delay these sanctions measures, to sort of blunt that process. And it was quite effective. And he's done this before in the past again and again. The Russians were doing this even going back into the 1990s with Chechnya. So I think Putin's tactic here is quite clear. He's faced with this. Trump has set a deadline. He said, OK, you've got until the 8th of August. And so on the 6th of August, Putin comes out with this new initiative, let's have a summit with Trump. Now, of course, this appeals to Trump because Trump loves the idea of summits. He loves the idea of personal politics, of him being the man who decides everything, of coming into the room with other leaders, especially Putin, and sitting down and making big decisions. So this appeals very much to Trump's ego, to his vision, his worldview. But I think it's really all about Putin avoiding the sanctions measures, avoiding tariffs, and sort of changing the narrative a little bit, changing the discussion. So that's why it was so rushed. Why is it in Alaska? Well, that's a very interesting question. I think there are some practical factors here. I think it's convenient for Putin to move. I think first of all, I would say it's very clearly it's Putin's choice. It's not the American choice. It's very clearly Putin's choice. So I think on a practical level, holding it in Alaska prevents Putin from having to fly over a lot of European countries where he might be arrested as a war criminal, number one. It also allows him to move the meeting very far away from Europe because he doesn't want Europe to be involved. He just wants it to be Trump and Putin, the two top guys meeting Ukraine is sidelined. Europe is sidelined. It's just the two top players. Putin re-establishes himself as a global leader. So that's very attractive to him. So Alaska serves that purpose. It's literally on the Russian border. I mean, we don't always think of it like that, but it is actually on the Russian border. So it's convenient, relatively speaking, for him to get to. It's far, far away from Europe, so it's very isolated from the Europeans. The Europeans are not involved. The other option was Rome. Now, if it was in Rome, you'd have the Italians there, obviously, but you'd also probably have the European Union people there. Everyone's close. It would feel like it was a summit with Europe. Europe would be the host. It would be a very different optic, so to speak. So by putting it in Alaska, Putin is able to isolate the Americans and the Russians from Europe, keep the Russians out of it, and he also has the practical security of not having to travel over countries that may be able to arrest him as a war criminal with the warrant for his arrest from the International Criminal Court. The other factor, of course, is that it's former Russian territory, so it's quite comfortable for Putin. It allows Putin to say that I'm going back to the historically Russian land. He's able to underline that America and Russia have this historical relationship where in the past they've reached agreements, they've traded land. You know, Alaska is one of the great traded territories in world history, and it is the great traded territory between America and Russia. So it's great optics in that sense as well, because it allows Putin to say, you know, we're going to trade Ukraine, we're going to cut Ukraine up, but there's nothing new there, there's nothing exceptional there, we shouldn't make a big fuss about it. This is quite normal. Look, we're in Alaska, we sold that to America, so this is nothing exceptional here. This is quite normal behaviour, this is very normal geopolitics. Let's calm down and let's get back to business. So it's a very clever, I would say, choice on the Russian part, and perhaps the final message I would say that he manages to send by having it in Alaska is saying, I'm coming to America as an honoured guest. I'm not a pariah anymore. I'm not a war criminal. I'm an honoured guest. Just last month, Putin was not able to attend the BRICS summit in Brazil, which is an ally of Russia, arguably certainly a member of BRICS, because the Brazilians couldn't guarantee he wouldn't be arrested for war crimes. 2 years ago in South Africa, it was the same story. Putin couldn't go there because he's a wanted war criminal. He couldn't go there. He's only travelled since the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued a warrant for Putin's arrest in March 2023. Putin's been very limited on where he can travel, and he's not travelled very far. He's mostly travelled only to former Russian colonies in the former Soviet world, maybe to China or somewhere like this, where he's got very strong, close ties. Now he's coming to America as a world leader. So he sends a powerful message to the whole world. I'm not a pariah anymore. I'm a serious guy, and you have to do business with me.
Well, that's very interesting. And let me ask another question, since you already mentioned that you don't believe that Putin will agree to have a ceasefire during this meeting. Do you think Putin might once again manage to outmaneuver everyone, especially during this meeting with Trump?
Well, I think his goals are going to be quite clear. Putin's goals he's going to have two main goals here. His first goal is going to be to delay further measures against Russia to allow him to continue the war. So he's going to, I would anticipate, he's going to propose the establishment of some commissions to talk about peace terms, the commissions to talk about, you know, ceasefires at sea, in the air, on energy infrastructure, on civilian infrastructure, freezing of front lines, sanctions, whatever it may be. He's going to create the impression of action toward peace. Let's set up a talking group here, let's set up an expert group there, let's set up a commission or whatever it may be, in order to basically take time. And then when the Americans say, well, we need to impose more sanctions, he's going to say, well, hold on, come on. Let's give it a chance for these things to work. Let's give peace a chance. We need to let things go. I think that's going to be his first objective, to create the impression of some form of activity, which is going to allow him, it's going to buy him, you know, maybe 2 or 3 months of more time to continue the war without getting these additional measures against him, against Russia, the sanctions measures, the tariff measures against Russia's trading partners like India and China, measures against Russian banking system, measures against Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers, all these things that are being discussed and that are being done partially, but there's always this threat that the West is going to get serious and Trump himself is going to get serious. So his top priority is going to be stalling tactics, buying time, stretching it out further and creating the impression of peace. The other thing on his agenda, the other key point on his agenda is going to be trying to divide the West, to get Trump to split from Europe, to say basically, you know, essentially, you're a great guy, Trump, I love you, we love America, we want to work with America, but these Europeans, well, they're troublesome, they're warmongers, they want war, they're the ones who are causing the war now, they're the problem. So we need to work together, me and you know, Trump and Putin need to work together as the two great world leaders to stop these Europeans who are trying to cause a war here, trying to cause a bigger war, trying to prolong the war, trying to prevent peace. So that's going to be a secondary message, I think. I want peace. Let's set up all sorts of different structures to try and establish this peace. They'll all be rubbish. They'll all be nonsense. But he'll try and do that to try and stall for time. And then the other message will be, let's work against the Europeans. Let's not let them stop us working toward peace.
Since you already mentioned sanctions, at the end of July you published a UkraineAlert report at the Atlantic Council saying that the US President Donald Trump was very disappointed with Putin and gave him 10 more days to agree to a ceasefire or face new sanctions. And basically the deadline passed last Friday, but no new sanctions, as we know, were imposed. So when do you think Trump's patience will actually run out? And what does the lack of sanctions mean? Do you think Trump is giving Putin another peace chance, I would say?
Yeah, well, this is what this summit's all about. This summit is all about avoiding sanctions, first and foremost. And not only sanctions. When we talk about sanctions, we really should talk more broadly about economic measures, because I think the sanctions is, you know, there's direct sanctions on Russia, there's indirect sanctions on Russia's economic partners like India and China. There are tariffs on Russia's exports and on the customers, Russia's customers. And there are also, I think, the most important economic measure of all would be efforts to bring down the price of oil on the world market, which could have a major impact on the Russian economy. And that's something that Trump has spoken about quite openly. And I would imagine that there's a lot of discussion behind the scenes about how to do that. And Trump has a very good working relationship, for example, with the Saudis. Now, the Saudis can play a key role in bringing down the price of oil, potentially. You know, so these are all measures that Trump can do. So again, what we're seeing here with this summit is all about Putin saying, hold on, don't do it yet. Let's have this talk. Let's have all these debates about potential peace moves and steps toward peace. And of course, if we're going to do that, of course we can't have sanctions, because that will be counterproductive. Now, I think, to be fair, Trump also is not very eager to impose these sanctions. He's not rushing to do it. You know, so he welcomes the opportunity to have an excuse to say, okay, we're not going to do it now. But fundamentally, this is all about Vladimir Putin using his stalling tactics, which he's done since January, since Trump returned to the White House. He's used these tactics again and again and again and again. And every time Trump says, you know what, you know, you mentioned him, when's he going to run out of patience? Every time Trump looks like he's about to run out of patience, Putin comes up with a new trick. If it's direct talks with the Ukrainians in Istanbul, or it's talks with the Americans in Saudi Arabia we had first of all, and so on and so on. So, of course, at some point, it has to become too much. But for now, there's always this sense, come on, give it a chance, give it a chance. And as long as Trump can sell it to his audience in America, his core audience, his voters essentially, it can continue almost endlessly. I think at some point it will get to we will reach the moment where even his hardcore base in America says we're being made fools of here. Trump, Putin is just laughing at us. But we're not there yet, clearly. And now we're in a new round. Now we've got, but every time, I think it's important to point out, every time Putin has to come up with something bigger. So first of all, he's saying, okay, let's get our teams together in Saudi Arabia. Then he's like, okay, we're going to have direct talks with Ukraine in Istanbul. Now he's saying, okay, now we're going to have a summit between me and Trump ourselves, personal summit. So, it's hard to know where they're going to go beyond that. He's already got this may be his trump card, as it were, that he's played now. So who knows? But at this stage, it's not clear when he's going to run out of patience.
Another statement which I also want to discuss, Trump suggested that US is proposing territorial concession by Kyiv, including returning some Ukrainian-led areas to Russia. What exactly does it mean? And are we basically talking about Ukraine giving up its own lands to Russia?
Well, we don't know exactly what he means. You know, when we talk, I mean, I think the key point in here is de facto or de jure, legally, officially, or just recognition. Now, Ukraine itself has said, as President Zelensky and many Ukrainian officials have said for a long time now, for over a year, I would say, you know, they recognize that a peace deal is likely going to mean accepting the long-term occupation of the areas of Ukraine that are currently occupied, more or less. I mean, there might be some minor corrections to the front lines here or there, you know, around certain strategic areas, perhaps to create a more permanent border or a more defendable border, you know, where in terms of geographical elements like rivers and so forth. But fundamentally, I mean, the Ukrainians have been saying for some time, we recognise this. We recognise that we're going to have to acknowledge this and accept this, and we're going to have to say, okay, we're going to forego a military solution and we're going to work diplomatically to get this territory back. What the Ukrainians have always said they will not do is officially cede the territory to Russia, to change the map, as it were, to redraw the maps and say, okay, you know, Donetsk is now Russian, you know, Lugansk is now Russian, or, you know, Kherson or Zaporizhia, whatever it may be, regions, Berdyansk, all these areas that are under Russian, or Crimea for that matter, all these areas under Russian occupation. So Trump has not specifically addressed that. He's not said whether he thinks that Ukraine will have to officially cede territory to Russia or whether it will de facto have to acknowledge that this area is controlled by Russia. And that's a big red line. That's going to be a sticking point. So we need to see what they mean by that and what the Russian position is, because that could be, you know, that everything could hinge on that. If the Russians say no deal unless we officially get this territory recognized by Ukraine and then by the whole international community as Russian, then it's no deal, because there's no way that any Ukrainian government will accept that, and there's no way, frankly, I think that if for whatever reason the Ukrainians said, you know what, fine, I think that most European countries nevertheless would say, we're never recognising that. Because as soon as you recognise that, you're eventually saying the entire post-World War II world order, where the fundamental ruling is you cannot change borders by force, is gone. And then every single country in the world knows, okay, so I can change a border by force, and then I can get the world to recognise it. We're back to basics. We're back to the 19th century, the 18th century even. We're back to a world where might makes right, where countries can be invaded, where borders are no longer inviolable, massive insecurity. You know, so much of the world we live in today depends on these fundamental securities that we have, based on that principle, that core principle that you cannot change borders by force. So I don't think it's possible for Russia to get that recognition internationally or from Ukraine, and that's what it all will come down to. Now, if Russia insists on that, knowing that it can't get it, that tells us that Russia doesn't want peace. That tells us that Russia is simply using that issue to create a scenario where they do not want peace, they want to continue the war, but they want to create the impression that it's not their fault, that it's the fault of the Ukrainians or the Europeans or whoever.
That's actually a very interesting point with the world of based on the rule of law and the international law. But do you think Russia care about the international law at all? And at the end, we have a bit of difference with the 19th century. Now we have nuclear weapons. Do you think it could be used?
No, I mean, of course, nuclear weapons have changed international relations profoundly over the last 70 years, 80 years. But I don't think that we're anywhere near the use of nuclear weapons here in Ukraine. I think on the contrary, I think this war's shown that they will not be used, perhaps paradoxically. I mean, and what Russia has done is Russia has shown that it can use the threat of nuclear weapons very effectively. Arguably Russia's greatest weapon in this whole war, the whole of this campaign, if you look at what Russia has managed to achieve and what it's not managed to achieve, the greatest success it's had has been intimidating the West. And it's done so with the use of nuclear blackmail. So Putin has used nuclear blackmail throughout the war at various times. From the very, very first days, the very first day, he used nuclear threats. When they were annexing or announcing the annexation of territories in 2022, again, we heard Putin saying, I am not bluffing, I will use nuclear weapons, essentially. And he's done so repeatedly throughout the war. Him and other senior Kremlin figures like Medvedev have used the threat of nuclear warfare to try and intimidate Ukraine, for example, to try and prevent Ukraine from attacking Russian military targets in Crimea. Mm-hmm. Now, Ukraine is not intimidated, and Ukraine has basically called Putin's bluff again and again. Days after Putin said, "I'll use nuclear weapons to defend my new conquest in Ukraine," in 2022, just days after that happened, Ukraine liberated Kherson, which was the biggest city that they'd managed to conquer. And Putin did nothing. He just retreated back across the Dnipro, and there was obviously no nuclear escalation, no escalation whatsoever. So, then Ukraine has managed to launch a very successful campaign against the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. Again, no nuclear reaction from the Russians. Instead, Putin has withdrawn his fleet back to Russia itself, away from Ukraine, away from Crimea, without escalating, without any nuclear attacks. Then last year, we even saw Ukraine invading Russia itself, going into the Kursk region and holding territory there for almost a year. And again, the first invasion of Russia since World War II. And Putin had the choice. Do I escalate? Do I make good on all my nuclear threats? Mm-hmm. He went the other direction. He downplayed it and said, it's nothing serious. Don't talk about it. Don't make a big deal out of it. He said to all the Russian propaganda machine, all the Russian media, don't talk about it. Don't make a big deal out of it. It's nothing special, and so on. So, we've seen Ukraine has shown by its actions that Putin's nuclear blackmail is a bluff. It's absolutely a bluff. He won't use nuclear weapons. And we saw this most recently, I think, when, again, Medvedev started making some nuclear comments to Trump. And Trump is not Joe Biden. He's not, whatever he may or may not be. He doesn't like being bullied in that sense. And he wasn't intimidated. He came out and said, OK, American nuclear submarines, let's move them there close to Russia. Whatever that may or may not have meant. Russia's reaction was very telling. Again, rather than escalate, they immediately said, oh, no, we didn't mean that. No. Essentially, the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov came out and said, don't listen to Medvedev, don't listen to this guy, he's not serious. We want to be very serious about this, it's a very serious topic, basically downplaying it. So, the Russian nuclear threats are a bluff, and they will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I think that's been demonstrated conclusively by Ukraine and by Ukraine's actions. But having said that, it does have a big effect on Ukraine's allies, because we've seen again and again they're cautious about doing anything to confront the Russians, or especially in terms of what they're prepared to provide for Ukraine. And they say it, often they say openly, we're afraid of nuclear weapons. When Biden was assessing his role in this war, when he was leaving the White House, he said very specifically, I think it was like the second point he made, I managed to help Ukraine survive, I allowed Ukraine to survive. And then I think the second point he made was, I avoided nuclear war. So he considered that to be a great success. Actually, the success was Putin's, because Putin had made him think there was a chance of nuclear war to avoid. There was no chance of nuclear war, and Biden should have been strong enough and tough enough to call his bluff himself from the very first day, but he didn't. Instead, after almost 3 years, he was still congratulating himself on having avoided a war that was never actually under threat. There was never actually a chance of it. But it shows how effective Putin's nuclear threats were, in fact. So I would say that nuclear war is no closer today than it was. In fact, probably further away, because we've seen the limitations of this of Russia's threats in practical terms. But we have seen, unfortunately, that these threats do work because Western countries are so cautious about taking even if there's a tiny 1% chance, that's too much for them. Their tolerance for risk is so low that they will not they are easily intimidated, basically, unfortunately.
I'm also curious, what do you think about Putin's official position? As you know, Putin keeps saying that 4 regions, namely Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, should become part of Russia, since they are now included in Russia's constitution. Personally, I'm from Zaporizhia, and I want to stress that the city itself is not occupied, but Putin is basically suggesting giving it up without even a fight. How does this position perceived in the U.S. government?
Well, I don't think the people in the U.S. government or in many Western countries, I don't think they fully appreciate how extreme Putin's position is. That he's essentially saying that Ukraine would need to surrender some of the biggest cities in the country to Putin in order to secure a peace deal. That would be an incredible concession from the Ukrainian side. I mean, it would almost be national suicide, frankly. If we're talking about, a small town here or a small town there or something on the border, okay, these things can be negotiated. They always are negotiated in big international treaties. But if we're talking about major cities, so I think, there's a few key points here from Putin's demands. One of them, as you say, is Zaporizhia, which is a city of around 750,000 people, I believe, pre-war, around that number. I mean, it's a very large, it's a major city. It's a major European city. It's not being conquered. It's a free city. It's part of Ukraine. It's ruled by Ukraine. So handing that over to Russia, almost inconceivable. Then if we look nearby, Kherson is even more hard to imagine handing over, although it's a smaller city than Zaporizhia, but it's across the Dnipro. If you gave that to Putin, he would then have a foothold to conquer the rest of Ukraine, to sweep down to Odessa and take over the Black Sea ports and cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. Well, that's the Ukrainian economy finished almost immediately. Odessa, again, is a huge city. So the idea that Ukraine would hand over Kherson and Zaporizhia, it's completely insane, basically. It beggars belief. And then also, if we look to the east, the cities in the Donbass that have not fallen to the Russians, a lot of places in Donetsk Oblast itself, so particularly Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, these are fortress cities. These places have been fortified since 2014, since this war began, since the early days of this war. They are the cornerstones, the absolute basis of Ukraine's defense in the east. If Ukraine handed them over, Russia has a free run all the way, arguably, to Kyiv itself. So, again, Russia's demands territorially for these cities and the rest of these regions really amount to a call for Ukraine's complete surrender. Ukraine would be a way of Ukraine committing suicide as an independent state, essentially. I'm not sure that's fully understood by most Western countries.
Recently, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has suggested that a future peace deal might effectively recognize Russia's control over parts of Ukraine, but without granting legal recognition to these territories. Doesn't this put the West in a very weak position if these territories remain under Russian control?
Well, the West is not prepared to free these territories, so the West will have to live with Russia occupying those territories unless it provides Ukraine with the weapons to do so. As far as I see, there's no chance at all of that. There's almost zero chance of that. So the West needs to live with that. Now, there is a precedent here. Throughout, from 1940 to 1990, the Baltic states were occupied by Russia, and they were never recognized as part of the Soviet Union. Officially, they were de facto. They were part of the Soviet Union, but they were never legally recognised as part of the Soviet Union. They were always recognised by the West as independent countries. So there is a precedent here in play, and there are other examples around the world. But specifically in relation to Russia and Russian imperialism, we have experience of this in the recent past. People have, there's still people in government today who are part of these policies. I mean, this is something that we've done before. So This will be, I think, at this stage, the most realistic approach to the question. Either you liberate the territories. There's three choices. You liberate them, you recognise them de facto as occupied, or you hand them over to Russia. Now, handing them over to Russia would be a complete disaster for the international order. Liberating them militarily, the West has got no appetite for that whatsoever. So all you're left with is accepting the de facto, the reality on the ground of occupation, never recognising it in a legal sense, de jure, and operating in this sort of grey legal zone, which would mean some areas, there'll be some limitations on these areas in terms of economic relationships, economic investments, in terms of the status of these regions, in terms of certain sanctions on Russia, but they would be ruled by Russia. They would be de facto recognised as part of Russia.
And talking about these territories, so do you expect these territories be deoccupied? Maybe I'm not talking about the near future, but in the future.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's realistic. I mean, I think it depends. I mean, again, we've seen this happen before. In the 1970s and early 1980s, a lot of people would have told you that the idea of Ukraine becoming an independent state was complete nonsense, was absolute fantasy. The idea of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania becoming independent, again, complete fantasy, never going to happen, unthinkable. And yet within 10 years it had happened. So you never know, you can never say never. A lot will depend on the settlement that's put in place and the Ukraine that emerges from that settlement. Is Ukraine able to emerge as a Western country that's integrating into the West, that has a genuinely sovereign and independent government that is able to pursue integration into the Euro-Atlantic community, with or without NATO membership, with hopefully European Union membership? That will be a huge factor. Again, that will be a huge pull factor to these occupied regions. It will be a huge push factor for the Russians, because that's exactly what they're fighting against, actually. They're not fighting for land here. They're fighting to avoid an independent and European Ukraine, because Putin fears that more than anything. So there are a lot of factors here, but I think it's certainly realistic. It's certainly possible. And we only have to look back one generation to see how it's already happened recently, in the recent past.
Mr. Rutte also raised the issue of what happens after a ceasefire. In my personal opinion, Ukraine's best security guarantees, of course, would be NATO membership, but that doesn't seem to be on the table right now. There has been some talks about potential sending European troops to Ukraine, but I'm not sure if it's popular right now. What security guarantee scenario do you see as a possible one, as a realistic one, especially considering Russia's history of violating such agreements?
Well, no, you're quite right. So we've got the best security guarantee will be NATO membership. That's not going to happen, frankly. Of course, again, anything can happen. So but within the realms of possibility, it looks extremely unlikely, virtually impossible. So I would say we can more or less exclude that at this stage. There was a lot of talk earlier this year about the so-called coalition of the willing and a deployment of troops to Ukraine to guarantee a ceasefire. But it was never clear what this coalition of the willing was willing to do. What were they talking about exactly here? And I think that idea now is being sort of quietly forgotten. I would say it's been it's dropped off the radar. We don't hear people talking about that anymore. I think that's telling, because realistically, it was a very vague idea. It was, I think, in response to the situation with Trump returning to the White House and saying we don't want to get involved anymore. This is Europe's problem. Europe was trying to show that they were somehow ready to do something, and they were putting together these very vague ideas about putting together a coalition of troops, but nobody knew what they would do. Would they fight? Would they defend? Would they respond when Russia attacked them, as Russia would? No answers. No one knew. And after a while, I think the weight of these questions got too much and people just basically stopped talking about it. So I think that's also, that idea has been tested and shown to be ineffective. It doesn't work. So then I think we're left with the realistic scenario where the only real Western military involvement in Ukraine could be the Air Force, Western air defences. So as we've seen in Israel, we've seen the British, the Americans, the French, other air forces operating as an air shield, basically shooting down Iranian missiles and drones fired into Israeli airspace. And they've been able to do so very effectively, extremely effectively, extremely successfully. Now, they could do that in Ukraine, again, extremely successfully, extremely effectively, and that would not put them into direct military conflict with the Russians. They wouldn't have to attack Russian airplanes, they wouldn't have to attack Russian bases, they would have to monitor them, but they would not have to attack them. So that could potentially be one format in which the West could play a significant military role in safeguarding Ukraine going forward. It could safeguard Ukraine's airspace, perhaps not the whole country, but certainly West Ukraine, perhaps up to Kyiv, or up to the Dnieper River, Odessa in the south. So that would be a very significant role, because then you'd have a large part of Ukraine would be, not entirely, nothing can be entirely secure from ballistic missiles, but a large part of Ukraine would be largely secured. You could obviously have much more investment, you could have much more business activity, families could return home who've been refugees, who don't feel safe at the moment, to come back to Ukraine. You could also have the airports could open. You could have air travel. So a lot could be done by securing, at least partially securing Ukraine's airspace. But if we talk about security guarantees in the very broadest sense, i.e., stopping another Russian invasion, it's only going to come from Ukraine themselves. Ukraine's security guarantee is the Ukrainian army. Now, of course, that's also going to depend a lot on the Western support that Ukraine receives. And I would hope, looking ahead now, I think we're already in a new era of European security, and Ukraine is the foundation stone, perhaps, or one of the central pillars of European security going forward. It's the biggest army in Europe. It's the best army in Europe, I would say. It's by far the most experienced army in Europe. It's the most combat-ready army in Europe, and so on and so forth. So it's absolutely indispensable now to European security. And Ukraine also has a very rapidly expanding defence industrial base. So I would hope that that's going to continue to grow. The military will stay strong, and the Europeans will do whatever they can to finance Ukraine and to work on joint projects with Ukraine to strengthen Ukrainian military. But that's realistically the best we can hope for, I think, at this stage. A strong Ukraine military supported by Europe, America as well. But I think you wouldn't want to depend on America in the current environment. So it's really all about Europe supporting Ukraine to be as strong as possible going forward, hopefully with an air component. But that's also depends on political will. But certainly Europe has a big self-interest in making Ukraine as strong as possible.
With talks of Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, some European allies want Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to be present there. But the US Vice President J.D. Vance suggests Zelensky should meet Putin only after Trump has set the stage for the talks. Given their stalled progress in their last meeting in 2019, do you think this sequence can actually lead to meaningful negotiations?
Well, I mean, I think at this stage, Putin wouldn't meet Zelensky. He would refuse to meet Zelensky. If that were the proposal, he would just say, no, I won't do it. Putin's entire position, his entire propaganda sort of architecture, as it were, is built around the idea that Ukraine is not a legitimate country and Zelensky is not a legitimate leader. So he can't take the risk of standing next to Zelensky and legitimizing Zelensky and saying, okay, I'm the leader of Russia, you're the leader of Ukraine, we're equals. We're equals. No, we're not equals. I'm the leader of Russia, I stand next to the leader of America, we're equals. That's Putin's philosophy. That's the way he sees it. That's the way it's got to be. If he goes and sits down with Zelensky, he's legitimizing Zelensky and saying, okay, you are the leader of a legitimate country. Ukraine is a legitimate country. You are the legitimate leader of that country. That's disastrous for Russia. Disaster from a propaganda point of view. So I don't think Putin will agree to that yet. He may have to agree at some point if we get to the point where they need that meeting to seal the deal, as it were, to finalize a peace agreement, perhaps. But again, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, like sometimes deals can be made by teams of delegates or whatever. They don't necessarily have to meet at the top level. So I think that Putin will be very, very reluctant to hold a meeting ever with Zelensky. Certainly now he will not do it. I think if they pressure him to do that now, I think he would probably rather withdraw from the summit than actually go ahead and do it. And the Americans seem to sense that because they're being quite cautious about how they frame it. Initially, there was some commentaries coming out from the White House who were cited by different media saying, Trump insists on Zelensky. He insists on it. He won't go ahead with it without Zelensky. And then within a few hours, they said, no, he will go ahead with it without Zelensky. So obviously, I think what happened here is that the Russians said, forget about it. It's off. If you insist on Zelensky, we're out. We won't do it. Because that's how important it is for the Russians to maintain this myth that Ukraine doesn't exist.
And my last short question. Given that any peace deal will have a direct impact to all Europe, yet European countries seems largely be sidelined from the negotiations. What does it say about this process? And with Russia's military budget at the Cold War level, does Trump fully understand the risk of escalation and the threat to Baltic states and Poland right now?
Well, I'm not sure whether I think Trump is learning about the risks. I mean, he's also getting information all the time about this, and perhaps also unlearning some of the bad information that he's had in the past. So he's starting to appreciate that this is a much broader threat. But I think there's still a lot. It's still clearly not fully understood by Trump and the people around him. The whole notion that we have now of Trump saying we're going to trade a little bit of land, we're going to swap a little bit of territory. This is not a war about territory. This is not a war for land. Putin is not fighting for land. Putin is fighting to re-establish the Russian Empire, to reverse the collapse of 1991, to change the geopolitical structure of the world, to have a new world where might is right, where major imperial powers dominate their neighbours, and where they're able to change borders by force. This is Putin's goal. Putin wants to create an environment where his ambitions go far, far beyond Ukraine. He talks about reconquering historically Russian lands. Now, historically Russian lands also include Finland, Poland, arguably, if we include the Soviet Union, all the way up to East Germany and Berlin. Certainly, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, down toward the Balkans. And then, of course, all of Central Asia, the Southern Caucasus. Putin's goals reach far, far beyond Ukraine. Ukraine is the key focus he has because it's such a symbol to him of the Soviet collapse. When Putin talks about the Soviet collapse being a geopolitical catastrophe, he's talking primarily about Ukraine because he sees it as the heartlands of Russia and the Russian Empire. He wants to get that back, and he thinks until he gets that back, he can't achieve any of his other goals. But those goals all hinge on Ukraine. But Ukraine is not the end, it's just the beginning. Once he gets Ukraine back, he goes on from there. And that's the key point that I think that a lot of people have not really realised. And when Trump talks about swapping territories and making compromises, that scares me particularly because I think it says to me very clearly he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand the scale of the ambitions of this man, Vladimir Putin, and what he represents, the imperial goals that he has and what he's trying to achieve. So it's going to be a very painful learning process, I think, for him and for all of us. But it's absolutely vital that he go through this and that he actually begins to understand what Putin's all about.
Mr. Dickinson, thank you very much for this interesting and conversation and for your insights.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.